Hi everybody, this is Mr. T. Scott, and today we're going to be talking about market structures, why they exist, and why they're so important for the economy to influence competition and allows different types of firms to really make their mark and set themselves apart from other competitors in an industry. And ultimately, in some cases, it lead to several companies or a very small amount of companies to dominate that industry and really be well known and successful across the country. And the main thing that we're really going to focus on today is how competition lends itself to these different types of market structures and why competition is so important in the American economy to really make sure that there are other firms that can compete against each other and give each other some fire under themselves in order to really thrive as a company. You know, you don't want to be complacent as a company. You got to have some fresh competition to really keep you on your toes and have a lot of different firms come in and really challenge your share of a market. So today, the main focus is we're going to talk about the different types of competition and when those competition levels get much smaller to areas when they start to be considered oligopolies or monopolies, and how these companies really start to gain their influence and why you hear more about the big box stores or the chains as opposed to the smaller mom and pop stores and what these companies have done in order to gain a larger part of the market. So we're going to learn about competition, we're going to learn about why these companies have become successful, and why some industries only have a small number of players that really control a large share of the market. When you're driving around through town, you'll see a lot of different companies. You're going to see some chain stores. You're going to see some mom and pop shops. And this goes back to the American ideal of competition. And that's something that really makes the American economy really vibrant, is it gives the opportunity for a lot of different firms to compete against each other. That's the lifeblood of competition and the lifeblood of the American economy, is when multiple people can start up companies and compete against each other to really make a statement and dominate an industry. And there's two different types of competition. There's pure competition and monopolistic competition. Now, pure competition is kind of like a marathon. When you start a marathon, you're about to get running and you're packed together, well, at least before COVID, with hundreds of runners. Could be the most athletic runners in the country. Could be amateur runners, could be like the average runner who doesn't really run that many marathons, or even the people that have not run a marathon at all or running it for charity. You've got hundreds and hundreds of runners packed together at the starting line. And at that point, everyone's in equal standing. You know, no one's winning the race over each other yet. The clock hasn't started. In theory, in pure competition, everyone's kind of starting on the same plane. But in reality, some of these people or firms have advantages over others. And it all goes back to the means of production and the resources that really make people stand out. Let's say some of these companies have more capital. You know, they have more resources at their disposal. They have larger facilities to make products or more people to perform certain services. Or they have more people to make the product or do different types of things. These advantages really help companies stand out from each other. And this is why, even though pure competition is open to anybody, the competition is heavy due to the large number of participants. And to try to make each other stand out or try to stand out from one another, they'll start to decrease their prices. And some businesses will end up dropping out because the prices drops will not be able to sustain themselves. They might have a lot of startup costs. They might need to pay the people to make the products. And if they're not selling enough products, if one company is selling more products than the other, and they're continuing to lower prices to try to make themselves stand out, then ultimately they won't have enough money to pay for resources or pay their employees or really improve the quality of their product. And as a result, they're going to drop out. And that's going to lead to fewer and fewer companies in the competition. So really, in pure competition, anybody could play. But due to a lot of different factors that we just talked about, only a few can actually win. And this transitions us over to monopolistic competition. And monopolistic competition is when a smaller number of firms as opposed to the thousands of firms that could enter under pure competition in theory. This usually is limited to about 20 to 200 firms that are competing against each other and are trying to stand out by making similar products. An example of this would be hotels or gas stations. And you probably encounter a lot of hotels or gas stations when you're on the road. A couple weeks ago, I was driving back from my parents' place in North Carolina and wanted to stop the night over in Harrisburg, Virginia after 9 hours of driving. I get off the highway, I was going up Route 81, and you get off the road and you encounter a large slew of gas stations and a large slew of hotels, the ultimate highway exit. And when I got off the highway, I probably saw about 9 or 10 hotels and about 7 or 8 gas stations within a mile radius of the highway. And what's going to make these hotels stand out from the other? What's going to make me want to go to a certain gas station over another? And that's when, even though these businesses sell similar products, that's when they have to get creative. So for instance, you have a bunch of hotels, they basically at their root sell the same product. They sell a room, they sell a bed, a blanket, a shower, that's the bare minimum. But what's going to make one hotel stand out from the other so that when someone's scrolling through hotels.com or looking through a directory trying to find a hotel, what are they going to do to pick the right hotel for them? Some people might pay extra for Wi-Fi. Some people might spend an extra couple of dollars for certain types of hotels. Maybe they have free continental breakfast or a swimming pool or amenities, or they're near a certain area. There's different types of things that allow these companies to stand out from one another, even though at the root they sell the same product. But maybe they have lower prices. Maybe they go by the hour, or they go for extended stay, or they have better Wi-Fi than another. Maybe they're in a better part of town. There's a lot of different factors that allow these hotels, even though they are competing against each other and selling similar goods, that make them stand out and allow people, maybe they're looking for a place to crash, like for the night. Like for me, when I was driving through Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, I wasn't really looking for much, just a place to rest my head and then get up in the morning and drive about 200 more miles back to Rhode Island. But for some people, they might have families, they might want some activities for the kids, or might be near somewhere where there's a lot of restaurants or community or nightlife. There's a lot of different factors. Location's huge. The staff is huge. If a hotel has a reputation of having a very friendly staff, or they might have a reputation of having very clean rooms, that helps them establish a brand. And for some customers, that's very important. Maybe for some others, they might have a better type of breakfast or better Wi-Fi or different sorts of things that really differentiate themselves from other firms. And so with monopolistic competition, similar goods, but different businesses, a smaller number of businesses like gas stations, hotels, these different firms have to come up with unique ways to really make their own brand and stand out from the smaller but still potent pool of competitors in order to make business and really be successful. And so ultimately, with pure competition and monopolistic competition, the pool of businesses really go from an infinite, in theory, number of businesses in pure competition to a very small number of businesses ultimately in monopolistic competition. And then we switch gears to an even smaller competition, and that's when we start talking about oligopolies. Now, I'll go back to the marathon example for just a second. Remember how in the beginning we had those hundreds of runners running against each other? But then let's say you start going about a mile in and you start seeing a smaller number of competitors at the start of the line, your elite level runners. And then everyone else who's trying starts to fall off and really starts falling behind. But in an oligopoly, there are about only 2 or 10 competitors at the very front of the race, dominating all over the smaller companies. And you start to see these different types of industries really pop up as you start getting into larger types of business. Perfect example of an oligopoly where only 2 companies really dominate the market is the soda industry. When you think soda, you think of Coca-Cola and Pepsi. That's one of the ultimate icebreaker questions. What do you like better, Coke or Pepsi? Because they are so dominant of the market, you don't really start thinking about like the other types of soda out there. You start thinking about, your Dr. Peppers, your 7-Ups, your Orange Crush, these other types of sodas, RC Cola, maybe the smaller types of companies that make fancy soda as well. They are not the dominant company in their industry. Coca-Cola and Pepsi, they dominate roughly 80% of the market. And they are able to dominate because they've been around for so long and they've been able to buy out their competitors, or at least a big portion of them, and diversify into other industries that have really made them successful. Coca-Cola and Pepsi have been around for decades, and they've been dominating their industry for decades. And when people think of soda, it's pretty synonymous. They think of Coke or Pepsi. Another example of this would be cellular service providers. The big four in terms of cellular service providers: AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint, Verizon. These are the big four in terms of what you think about with cell service providers. Probably you all in the class at least have either Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, or T-Mobile as your primary mobile provider. That's because they've been able to really branch out and do a lot to distinguish themselves from the competition. In theory, there could be hundreds of cellular service providers, but because they have been able to buy out their competition, make themselves stand out, and have been around long enough, some of these companies have been able to really stand out and dominate a larger share of the market as a result. And the list goes on and on of the different types of oligopolies. You've got your breakfast cereals. You've got major media corporations, like Viacom, Disney, CBS, NBC Universal. All these different types of conglomerates, they own about 85% of television channels and networks on cable. And that's a big number of channels, and they're able to, in turn, have a big say over what is broadcast and all these different types of things. Domestic airlines, another big example of an oligopoly. You probably think of about 4 major airlines, and let's take a look and see how this looks. In 2018, there were 4 airlines, domestic airlines in the United States, that dominated roughly 75% of the market in terms of airline travel. Those big 4: Southwest Airlines, American Airlines, Delta, and United. And of course, you've got your smaller airlines. You got your JetBlues, you got your Alaska Air, Spirit, Frontier, Allegiant, SkyWest. You've got a lot of smaller companies. But the problem is they make up such a tiny, tiny part of the market. But those 4 companies, United Air, Delta, Southwest, and American Airlines, they dominate the industry because they've been able to buy out smaller competitors. They put up reasonable prices, and they have such a large share of the market already that they are able to stay viable. Also due to name recognition, they work with a lot of different airlines. Like these smaller airlines only maybe fly out of a small number of airports. But whenever you go to the airport, you probably see a Southwest flight or an American Air or United or Delta. You see these different types of airlines, these 4 primarily, because they mainly do business in all the major airports, whereas some of these more regional companies only operate in a certain part of the country. Another example of an oligopoly could be delivery services or pizza delivery companies too. You think of the big 4 in terms of pizza delivery, major pizza delivery. Of course, you think of like your local pizza shops, but they don't dominate across the country. The major 4 across the country in terms of pizza delivery: Pizza Hut, Papa John's, Domino's, and Little Caesars. They are a major 4 in terms of the market share, in terms of ready-to-order pizza or delivery. Another example of this would be third-party delivery services. When you think of DoorDash or Postmates or Grubhub or Uber Eats, They are four companies, but they dominate about 90% of their market in a relatively new industry. About 10, 15 years ago, these companies didn't exist, and the need for third-party delivery service was still in its infancy, where you can order food from smaller restaurants and just have somebody drop it off at your apartment or your house. 15 years ago, that was not the case. You'd have to call the company, like the pizza company, like you're ordering pizza, let's say, from Pizzoni's. You'd be like, hi, can I order a cheese pizza? Or you have to call Domino's. It wasn't like you can go on your phone and order it directly off an app or go through like Grubhub or DoorDash or all these other companies. That's been a new innovation that's come out in the last 15 years. And it shows that in certain industries, you don't have to be around for decades in order to dominate. You could only be around, say, for 10, 15 years, and you could still find a way to dominate. You don't have to be the oldest cat in the store in order to be the most admired. Perfect example of this could be in sodas. Believe it or not, Dr. Pepper is actually older than Coca-Cola by 3 months. Yet, we don't hear Dr. Pepper mentioned in the same sentence in terms of market share as Coca-Cola or Pepsi. That's because Coca-Cola went more national more quickly, as did Pepsi. Dr. Pepper was more of a regional drink for the first 4 or 5 somewhat decades of it existence, and ultimately ended up becoming a major player, but not to the level as Coke or Pepsi. So you don't have to be the first to do something like, with wireless computer communications. You would think of web chatting. You wouldn't at first think about Zoom or Google Classrooms or Google Meet as the dominant entity. Back in the day, Skype was the major virtual chat in terms of webcam chat out there. But since the pandemic, they never really took off. And then small, like other companies, Zoom and Google Meet and these other web services began to dominate and really make money off of web chatting or web calls with the Zoom, with web cameras and all that good stuff. So, moral of the story is you don't have to be the first in order to be the most successful. They could do other companies can find ways to defeat you that are maybe newer and more upstart and have more resources, and ultimately they can find ways to be more successful and in turn dominate the industry. And then another type of oligopoly, which is more restrictive in terms of competition, is called a cartel. And no, not a drug cartel. This is a cartel in terms of consolidated competition. A cartel is a group of firms that come together to maintain prices and total output at certain levels while reducing outside competition. If you anger one member of this group, you risk doing business with the others. And there are 2 notable cartels that operate in the world, and one specifically here in the United States. The oil industry across the world. There are a lot of countries that work together in terms of oil production. These are some countries that oil is their major export, and they play a big role in selling oil to other countries that maybe don't have the capacity to make their own oil. So you've got your countries like Venezuela, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, UAE, Saudi Arabia, all these countries that are major oil producers, and they've come together to form OPEC, which is a cartel of all these oil countries, and they come together to set the prices of oil and whom they can distribute that oil to. And if you anger one member of OPEC, you risk angering all the members of OPEC, and you might not have a lot of business partners in terms of importing oil. Another example of a cartel, which is a little more localized, is in collegiate athletics. Now, there are multiple types of collegiate athletics. In addition to the NCAA, which is the major one, you've got the NAIA, the NJCAA for junior colleges. You've got some associations that only have Christian colleges or very, very small colleges. But the most dominant player, the most lucrative in college athletics is the NCAA. The NCAA has been around since 1906, and they have over 1,000 colleges in its network of schools that compete against each other in Division I, II, and III. But the thing is, in the United States, the NCAA is really the one player in town if you want to be a lucratively successful program in college athletics, because the NCAA has all the television contracts. They have all the major schools in their network with a lot of endowment and a lot of fans wanting to see those games, especially at the Division I level, where you have about 128 schools in the Football Bowl subdivision, which is like the highest level of competition in college football. And then you've got 100 more schools in the FCS, which is the Football Championship subdivision. But with those 300 schools, along with the other schools that don't have a football program, let's say, they make up the lion's share of economic revenue for athletics. And let's say you're a college and you manage to tick off the NCAA. You want to break off and form your own league. It's going to be hard because the NCAA is such a strong hold on its members that, if other members leave, they won't be as likely to gain those television contracts. They won't be as likely to have those merchandising deals or the other types of revenue services that the NCAA can provide their schools. Now, whether or not they should pay their athletes, that's a whole other debate with this money that they gain. They gain billions of dollars a year in revenue, but the cartel of the NCAA exists because since they are the dominant athletic league in terms of collegiate athletics, if you want to have a major program in college athletics, for the most part, if you have a giant emphasis on athletics and you want to make a lot of money from athletics, you're joining the NCAA or you're taking advantage of what the NCAA has to offer, and you do not want to mess with the NCAA, because if you do, then you run the risk of losing money in athletics and not playing against the teams that can draw fans to your games and people to your stores and to your local businesses. Because, when people come for road games, they want to stay at hotels, they go to your bars, they go to restaurants to watch the game, or they go to the game and they tailgate. With college athletics, it's so important to keep that ebb and flow going and try not to disrupt the rhythm. So that's why the NCAA is a cartel, because if you really want to be a successful college in terms of athletic revenue, you have to operate through the NCAA in order to be financially successful. And this ultimately takes us to the last form of competition, the one that has gained the most scrutiny in American history. It spawned a game that is part of the American lexicon. It's called a monopoly. And we're not talking about like getting Atlantic Avenue or all the blue pieces or the railroads. A monopoly is when you become so dominant over an industry, one company dominates an entire industry over a certain area, that they've wiped out the competition and they are the industry in certain parts of the country or in the world. Like, they are the industry. They are the one company that is the dominant force. And so monopolies in the United States could exist in two different forms. One of them is illegal in the United States and has been illegal since the 1890s. But another is technically legal and operates in this country today. So starting off with pure monopolies, these are the type that are illegal. Pure monopolies occur when one company wipes out the competition and allows no space for a competitor to come in and try to ripple away its market share. These monopolies were very prominent in the late 1890s and the early 20th century. You think of the folks like Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie. You've got these folks that dominated industries, like they were tycoons. They were robber bandits, as some people would call them, because they had so much wealth and did not allow an inch of competition. If anyone tried, they were either bought out or they were driven out of business because these tycoons, these business executives, these rich men had so much power that they can just wipe out the competition and they would be the dominant force. So Standard Oil, a notable example of a monopoly that existed, and this was the dominant oil firm across the country. You know, if you were in the business of oil, you were always dealing with Standard Oil because they had such a grip over the industry that smaller firms were either bought out or they were pushed through legal reform to be pushed out of business in order for that one company, Standard Oil, to prosper. This started to change in the 1890s with the Sherman Antitrust Act. And this pretty much made monopolies of this form illegal because an American enterprise, in theory, every industry in the country should be open to competition. No one company should dominate an entire industry the way that Standard Oil or U.S. Steel or these other companies did. And so basically for a stretch in the 1890s, the early 20th century, the Sherman Antitrust Act was used to break up these monopolies. The Standard Oil monopoly was ultimately broken up in 1911, and this spawned off some smaller gas stations you might know today, like Sunoco or Chevron, and there's a whole other slew of other smaller gas stations that owe their beginning to the Standard Oil breakup. Also, U.S. Steel was broken up. A lot of different monopolies have been broken up as a result of the Antitrust Act that started in 1890. Another example of this was the Bell Systems of telecommunications. This was the dominant firm in terms of telecommunications up until the mid-20th century. Ultimately, that monopoly got broken up, and now you have your smaller firms in terms of telecommunications. Now that was the spawning start of AT&T and Verizon and all these other companies that owe their start to the breakup of the Bell telecommunications monopoly. They were actually referred to as baby bells when they first were started because Bell had such a communications dominance, and they were able to dominate the industry until antitrust legislation came in and their whole monopoly was broken up. And there are exceptions to monopolies in the United States. The first is when it comes to professional sports leagues. And there is a prominent Supreme Court case in the 1920s. The background of this Supreme Court case was that prior to 1915, there were only two major leagues for baseball. It was the American League and the National League. And those are the two that still exist today. But in 1914, a third league tried to enter the picture, the Federal League. And these were owners who wanted major league teams, but did not want to pay the fee to enter the American League or the National League. So for 2 seasons, the Federal League started to buy off players from the American League teams and the National League teams, and for 2 seasons had a legitimate major league going on. But ultimately, these teams were not able to stay viable, and the league folded up by 1915. So one of the owners of these teams, based out of Baltimore, sued the major leagues because they felt their influence drove the Federal League to extinction. And so this ultimately led to Baltimore Baseball Club versus American League, a Supreme Court case that basically ruled that Major League Baseball could operate as a monopoly because it promoted interstate commerce. The Interstate Commerce Clause is very important because it allows multiple states to benefit from having one dominant company instead of one company dominating in an entire area. Because it involves more firms across the country, the Interstate Commerce Clause was used for Major League Baseball, and that's why you only see the major leagues. In theory, you could have competition like the AFL and the NFL, they merged, and you have these other startup leagues that try to challenge the dominance of the existing major leagues. But due to interstate commerce, that's why these major leagues are allowed to exist as one entity. And now a different type of monopoly is a natural monopoly, and these are legal in the United States. A natural monopoly occurs when one company is allowed to be the sole provider of a service or product in a certain area. And you start thinking about electricity. In Rhode Island, there is only one major electrical provider, the National Grid. When you go down to South Carolina, it's more like an oligopoly because you've got several different firms. But in Rhode Island, in this particular area of the country, the National Grid is the one electrical provider in the United States. And they can operate so because they're providing a service that only they can provide. Another example of this would be the U.S. Postal Service, owned by the government, but they are the only authorized carrier of mail in the United States. You know, you've got your Amazons, your UPS, you've got these different types of firms that carry out shipping and stuff, but in terms of letters, the only company you can mail letters through is the U.S. Postal Service. Another example of a monopoly that's natural is in terms of trains. In terms of national train movement across the country, if you're going from Providence to New York or Providence to Washington, D.C., or Providence to, Southern Pines, South North Carolina, you're probably taking an Amtrak. You're not taking another train that could take you across state lines for the most part, or multiple state lines. I mean, sure, you've got the MBTA. You can take the Commerce Lane over from Providence to Boston, but for the most part, if you're traveling out of state via train, most likely you're taking an Amtrak, and that is the one company that is allowed to have such a dominant share over this industry because it's regulated by the government. And that's why you start to see these companies really dominate the industries because the government says it's okay for them to do. Like if these were private enterprises, they would not, but because they're authorized as the government provider of these goods and services, they are allowed to operate as a natural monopoly. And so throughout the lesson today, we've talked about examples of how these companies can really gain their power. You know, they could be authorized by the government in case of natural monopolies. But for private companies, there are a lot of different ways for them to really gain power over others. We've talked about having resources. We've talked about maybe having better equipment or better capital or better marketing. And those are ways to differentiate each other from other firms. But in terms of gaining power and really making themselves stand out through economic means, there are two ways that they can do this. And that involves buying up the means of production and buying up the competition so that way they can be the most successful and the most profitable. And so there are two different types of ways they can do this, and they both involve mergers. And so basically a merger is when two firms come together or multiple firms come together to form one completely new unit. The difference between mergers and acquisitions. A merger is when two firms are combined into one new legal entity. An acquisition is when one company is absorbed into the other company and they are no more. They now exist as a branch or an arm of this company that's a new entity. And so these are two types. There's horizontal mergers and vertical mergers. First one we're going to talk about is vertical mergers. And this is usually done between a distributor and a supplier. And the way I can think about this, the way that helps me think about this, is when you're drawing a line going up and down and going through the means of production, with cookies, for instance. You need somebody to make the chocolate chips. You need somebody to make the dough. You need somebody to make the flour. You need somebody to make all the machinery to make the cookies. You need somebody to make the packaging to make the cookies and someone to distribute the cookies. There's a lot of different arms to making cookies. It's not just throwing them in the oven, taking them out, and throwing them in a bag and selling them on the playground. If you're a legitimate cookie making business, there's a lot of different means of production. And so let's say Tim's Cookie Company is wanting to buy all the means of production under one roof and make it their own company. And so let's say I'm in charge of Tim's Cookie Company and I'm looking and I notice that my chocolate chip distributor, Philo's Chocolate Chips, is up for sale, and they need somebody to really infuse a lot of money to keep them operational. Now, they make great chocolate chips, and so I want to get everything under one roof, so I buy up the Philo Chocolate Chip Company. I buy up a packaging plant. I buy up flour distributors. So that way I have all these different things in the line of production under one roof. And that way I can control my costs that way. Instead of having to pay an outside cost for a certain type of product that I need in order to make my product, I can have everything under one roof. I can control the prices, I can control the capital, and I could do it in a way that is still very profitable. Meanwhile, you've got horizontal integration, which is, think about that starting line analogy. You've got competitors from left to right in the competition sphere when you're going up each other in a race. Horizontal integration occurs when a merger occurs between two companies that sell similar products in order to increase its collective market share. An example of this would be the NFL and AFL merger in 1970. So from 1960 to 1969, there were actually two professional football leagues, two major professional football leagues that played at the same time of year. The American Football League, which actually had teams like the Patriots, the Jets, the Chiefs, among others. And in the NFL, which was the more established league. But ultimately, because these two leagues competed against each other, not just in terms of talent, but for the final 4 years of the AFL's existence, they actually were the two sides that played each other in the Super Bowl. It actually started off, it wasn't even called the Super Bowl, it was called the AFL-NFL Championship. But then ultimately, the main goal of the AFL was not to be a long-term competitor of the NFL, it was to compete long enough so that way the NFL felt that they would need their members in order to survive. So ultimately, the AFL merged all of its teams into the NFL, and that ultimately became the NFL, but they divided the teams up into the AFC and the NFC in honor of those conference alignments. Another example in sports, the 1970s were a very prominent era in terms of mergers. In 1976, it was the ABA and the NBA merger. And this was different than the AFL-NFL merger because, unlike that merger, the basketball merger only incorporated 4 of the 6 teams in the ABA into the final merger. So, in the case of the ABA, you had 4 teams. You had the Pacers, the Nuggets, the Spurs, and the Nets that were able to be merged in. But then you had 2 other teams, the Spirits of St. Louis and the Kentucky Colonels, who were forced to fold and put their players in a dispersal draft because they could not raise the capital to ultimately merge into the NBA. Same thing with the WHL-NHL merger in 1979. Only a handful of teams, one of them was the Hartford Whalers, that ended up merging in, but some of the teams in that league either folded or left all their players to other teams because they could not afford to enter the NHL, and only a small number of teams were actually allowed to enter the league. So sometimes these mergers could be really seamless that all the companies under a larger firm could be merged in without negative repercussions, like in the AFL-NFL merger, or sometimes that the whole firm might lose some pieces because of terms of the merger, like in the WHL or the ABA mergers. Another example would be Cingular and AT&T merging. These are 2 competitors. But because Cingular was a smaller firm and they seemed to be less viable in the long term, AT&T, which is one of the largest companies in the cellular communications field, was able to buy out Cingular and merge it into one new company, therefore reducing the number of players in the field and reducing the major competitors to just a very small amount. And these could be very strategic, like in the soda industry, there was one instance where one firm that does not make up a lot of the market share bought up smaller brands like Dr. Pepper, 7-Up, Orange Crush, RC Cola are among the sodas that are under the one brand. But they do not make up the entirety of the market share because they still got to compete against Coca-Cola and Pepsi. but they're still a player in the industry, and they were able to combine together in order to be a larger player in market share. So sometimes it's to reduce the number of competitors, sometimes it's to combine together in order to stand out and compete against the larger firms. So that's when those two types of mergers really are helpful in terms of companies really gaining that muscle to be sustainable long term, but also more profitable in the long term and a more viable competitor over time. And that's the important thing about market structures, is that it allows as many players as possible to enter the field, but it also sets the stage for companies to be successful if they play their cards right, if they have the right amount of resources, if they have the right amount of capital, if they have quality capital or resources to put these products together or these services together. All in all, these are viable ways for these companies to maintain their thunder and really dominate the market share and ultimately become successful and viable competitors in the long term. So that's our talk today about market shares. If you have any other questions, let me know or Mr. Philo know. It was great talking to y'all, and I hope you learned something new today. Have a good day, everybody.